Hello, I'm Alessandra Zarcone. I work at the Fraunhofer IIS and I will be presenting work that I've carried out together with Vera Denver when I was at the University of Saarbrücken. The title is A Bathtub by Any Other Name, the reduction of German compounds in predictive contexts. So when we talk about things or living beings in the world, we can refer to them in different ways. We could say, he saw me some strawberries yesterday, or Tom saw me some strawberries yesterday, or the grocer or the greengrocer saw me some strawberries yesterday. So we can refer to the same referent using different referring expressions. But what drives the choice of referring expression? Why would we choose a shorter or a longer referring expression? So according to the uniform information density hypothesis, there is a tendency to distribute information over a message in a uniform way for optimal information transmission. So given two equivalent encodings, which can be used interchangeably, speakers would choose the shorter one in contexts where the referent is more predictable. So shorter encodings would be favored in more predictable contexts where the information content is lower. An example of this is the study by Mahowald and colleagues. They contrasted shorter and longer word forms in English, such as chimp, chimpanzee, in supportive contexts and neutral contexts. So a supportive context would be something like Susan was very bad at algebra, so she hated math. Or Susan introduced herself to me as someone who loved math, or could be biology, it could be something else. This is a forced choice sentence completion task where the participants had to pick one version or the other. And they found indeed that the short forms were used were chosen more often in the supportive context and then in the neutral context. So 67% of the time in supportive context versus 56% of the time in the neutral context. However, they chose words such as AC, ID, UK, so acronyms, or limousine, rhinoceros, chemotherapy, that are either acronyms or are words of foreign origin. So this is a phenomenon that is not very pervasive, arguably, in English. And also, shorter and longer forms differ for the register or style. We studied a similar phenomenon in German. We looked at German compounds and their base forms. So Weinglas, wineglass, or Badewanne, bathtub, or tub, and fingernagel, fingernail, nail. These are so-called determinative bimorphemic compounds and their base forms. Arguably, there's no registered difference between the two versions, but there is a difference in length, and also there is a difference in terms of lexical specification. This means that if there is a same category distractor, such as sect glass, then the more specialized compound, Weinglas, is preferred over just using glass, because you want to make the distinction with the distractor. This is a very productive phenomenon in German, and thus an ideal testbed for the UID hypothesis, as long as in our materials no other referent sharing the same base can be used in the same context. So we want to create a context where one could use either glass or Weinglas without any differences in terms of specificity. We contrasted a supportive context and a neutral context, such as Carola went for a manicure every second Saturday, or Carola cared a lot about her looks, and then she loved it when her something matched her outfit. This time, she had picked a bright green polish. In this case, the target is fingernagel or nagel, so her nails, her fingernails. We carried out a study on prolific with 80 German speakers, 36 items, each in a supportive or neutral version. And this was a sentence completion study with left and right context. Why did we have both the left and the right context? Because here we want to simulate production. And in production, arguably, people would always know what they will say next. Now, how do we know that the referent is actually more predictable in the supportive context condition? And also, can we rule out specificity? Are same category distractors also predictable? So to answer these questions, we carried out a norming study. In our norming study, we contrasted a supportive context again and a neutral context exactly as in the main study, and then we only presented the left context. We carried out also this study on prolific academic with 40 German speakers and 36 items. And this was a sentence completion study with left context only. In this case, we want to simulate comprehension. We want to know for a comprehender how predictable the target would be. So how do we know that the referent is more predictable in the main study, in the supportive context condition? Well, in the norming study, we saw that there was at 74% of target completions in the supportive context. Doesn't matter if they're short or long. Here we just want to know if the target, the referent, is predictable. We only found a 22% of target completions in the neural context. So there is a difference between the two. And just for reference, in the study by Mahovald and colleagues, they also carried out a norming study, and in the neutral context, the target referent was only predicted 1.6% of the time. So there is a stronger difference in terms of predictability of the referent compared to our study. However, we do have this difference as well, it's just a bit milder. We also wondered if in our context, same category distractors could also be elicited. This was actually not the case. So less than 1% of the completions could be a same category distractor, for example, Untertopf, Blumentopf. So we consider this to be rather marginal. So going back to the main study, we first looked at also here how often the target, doesn't matter if it was in the long or short condition, was elicited. Overall, it was elicited 89% of the time, and slightly more often in supportive context, so 93% of the time, and a bit less often, 85% in neutral ones. Non-target reference were excluded from the analysis, so we only looked at these 89% completions. However, of the non-target reference that we excluded, none of them was the same category distractor. So once again, we feel pretty confident that the compound and the base are indeed meaning equivalent. So what else did we find? That overall, independent of context, there's a baseline preference for the base form, for the shorter form, which was used 66% of the time. Context, whether it was supportive or neutral, did have a significant effect over what form was chosen. And the base form, the shorter one, was chosen more often in supportive contexts. So in supportive contexts, 72% of the completions were base form completions, and in the neutral context, 61% completions were base form completions. So now I would like to compare our study with a study by Mahovald and colleagues. They looked at English abbreviations, short and long forms, arguably with some register differences. And they had a forced choice sentence completion task. And in the incremental norming study, there was a difference in terms of referent predictability. 52.4% of target completions in supportive context were elicited, and only 1.6% in the neutral context. There is an overall preference for short forms and a significant effect of context on encoding. Short forms were chosen 67% of the time in supportive contexts and 56% of the time in neutral contexts. In our study, we looked at German compounds and their base forms, so arguably a more pervasive phenomenon with no registered differences between the compound and the base form, but we had to control for specificity. We also had a different task, so sentence completion with left and right context to simulate production. And we also had an incremental norming study to estimate the referent predictability. And we found that the referent was predicted 74% of the time in supportive context and 22% of the time in neutral context. So there is also a difference in terms of referent predictability in our study, but it's milder. And overall, in the main study, we found a preference for base forms, and we also found a significant effect of context on the choice of encoding. 72 times the base forms were elicited in supportive context, and our participants used the base forms 61% of the time in the neutral context. Now, if you're familiar with the Rational Speech Act framework, you could argue you could wonder how that relates with our results. The Rational Speech Act framework argues that language production and interpretation are a rational communicative process, which is driven by the utility of alternative utterances, as determined by communicative success or effort. When communicative success is at risk, for example, there is a same category distractor, then we prefer choices which help communicative success, and they typically are longer forms. So in this case, we would refer to the German Shepherd as dog, only if there is no same category distractor. But when a Dalmatian is present, we want to differentiate, so we want to ensure communicative success, and we would say German Shepherd. However, when communicative success is ensured, there is no same category distractor, for example, then we would pick a choice that requires less effort, so a shorter one, dog. In our study, we try to avoid that a same category distractor will be available. Therefore, we can argue that communicative success was ensured. Then why did speakers still choose longer forms and not the short ones, which would have required less effort? We could argue here that predictability is the determining factor, and the choice is driven by the tendency to optimally use the channel. If they didn't distribute the information in a uniform way, that would have led to peaks and troughs in the distribution, and arguably they would be costly for the comprehender, because cost can also be determined by information density and predictability. In this study, to conclude, we have shown some additional evidence that information is distributed over a message in a uniform way, and that low informativity leads to reductions in terms of length. This was shown in other studies in terms of syntactic structure reduction and also in diachronic change. In our study, we showed that low informativity leads to reductions in length also during the active use of language, and that the referent predictability can lead to basically a reduction in the surface form that is chosen to refer to the referent. And the shorter form is chosen when the referent is more predictable, less informative. This is evidence for efficient communicative design by information density control. I would now like to thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.